Everybody is talking about inflation right now, whether you're in the US or Europe, or if you've been dealing with hyperinflation for many years in countries like Venezuela or Zimbabwe. But what is inflation? What causes it? Is it bad? And what role can Bitcoin play in inflation? Let's check it out in this video. In basic terms, inflation is just the rise of prices over time. What is the purchasing power of a given amount of currency? Inflation always exists. That's why you can hear about 10-cent movie theater tickets or a nickel for a bottle of pop. You can use inflation calculators to figure out how much money was worth over the years, and it's pretty cool to see. But prices will always rise with the growing economy. But the question is, by how much? Let's move briefly then to what causes inflation. There are three main things. First off is the printing of money. Of course, governments control the printing of money, and if there's more money in circulation, then prices will increase as the money is devalued. Using a simple idea, if we have $100 in an economy and the price of bread is $1, if suddenly another $100 enters that economy, then that $1 for a piece of bread is inherently worth less. Additionally, governments can actually specifically devalue their currency on purpose, beyond printing new money. They might do this if they want to maintain trade balances with other nations, but it does add inflation because it lessens the value of the currency. Thirdly, people can request loans and bonds from the government, which also adds more money into the economy. This is where interest rates come in, another big term that you might hear. If there's too much inflation, then the central banks of countries can increase interest rates on these bonds and loans, making them more expensive and to demote the idea of borrowing. But how can you measure inflation? There's actually a few different ways, including the Consumer Price Index and the Producer Price Index. I won't go into the details of how these work, but essentially they are different ways to track the purchasing power of consumers and producers, and then use that to track inflation growth. Of course, there are questions about inflation being good or bad. Many capitalist economists argue that some inflation is inherently good. However, almost all agree that high inflation is bad. For example, in the United States, the minimum wage hasn't followed with inflation, meaning many Americans have much less purchasing power than they did years in the past. And the recent inflation means that many Americans are finding it harder to purchase groceries and other important things. But where does Bitcoin come in? Well, there's been a long argument that Bitcoin is actually, in fact, a strong inflation hedge because it's naturally scarce. After the last Bitcoin will be mined in the future, there will be no more Bitcoin. And when comparing Bitcoin with hyperinflation countries, it is done well. Lots of Venezuelans and Zimbabweans use Bitcoin, for example, because their own currencies are so unstable. But with Western currencies, Bitcoin hasn't done as well as an inflation hedge. With the recent inflation in the West, Bitcoin has instead gone down in price. Some argue that this is because Bitcoin is still young. It isn't established enough, so therefore it isn't as strong of an inflation hedge yet. But it certainly is true that Bitcoin does operate without governments being able to devalue it or to interfere in its production. Time will tell if it will become the inflation hedge that it has been prophesized to be. Thanks for watching.